and I just wanted to introduce now Israel Wayne. He is an author, speaker, and radio host who brings a timeless biblical message and is passionate about teaching others to defend the Christian faith and develop a biblical worldview. Israel is a homeschooling dad who has a tremendous amount of wisdom to share with us today. So welcome, Israel.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you setting time aside to talk to us. And tell us, first of all, a little bit more about yourself and your role in what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. It's an honor to be a guest here today. I was actually homeschooled myself way back in the pioneer homeschooling days in the United States. My mother began homeschooling my older sister and myself in 1978. The modern day homeschooling movement began about 5 years after that here in the US in 1983. And so we were out ahead of that a little bit. So basically everything that's ever happened in the formal modern day homeschooling movement, I've pretty much been there for all of it. In 1988, my mother started publishing a national homeschooling magazine called Homeschool Digest that she published until her death a year ago. And so I became the director of marketing for that after I graduated. I graduated from homeschooling in 1991. And January of 1993 became the marketing director for Homeschool Digest magazine, which I did for 20 years. And I married my wife, Brooke, 24 years ago. She was also homeschooled since 1983. We have 11 children. Our oldest is 23. Our youngest is 2. We have 6 girls and 5 boys who have been homeschooled from birth. So my wife and I are both homeschool graduates, homeschooling parents of 11. My day job really for the last 30 years has been working in homeschooling publishing and Christian publishing. I've been speaking at homeschooling conferences since 1995. So my private life, my professional life, all of it has very much been involved in the homeschooling movement. I'm also involved in leadership on state and national levels here in the United States. I am vice president of the Michigan State Homeschool Association, which has been around, longer than I've been involved, but about the last decade I've been serving there, and have worked as advisory council for the National Alliance of Christian Home Education Leadership. I've done a lot of things, writing books on homeschooling and lots of things. So anyway, looking very much forward to this conversation and hope it will be beneficial.
Wow, you do know a few things about homeschooling, I have to say. One of the things I wanted to ask you, if you could share the history of public schools, also known as the government schools. I know they go back to about the 1850s or so, I think, in the US, and in Canada, it was around Confederation, around 1867. I don't know exactly, or give or take a few years, but in that era. So we weren't that far apart. But I know you know a lot about that, and if you could talk to us about that and where we are today.
Sure. Well, if you look back over the last 6,000 years of human history, what has been dominant in history regarding education is parents directly teaching their own children. And I want to lay that down first as a foundational framework, because this experiment that we have of sending our children away from us to people that we don't know, to have them instruct our children for 10,000 to 15,000 hours during their developmental years is a very new, a very radical, novel, revolutionary concept. It has not been done dominantly throughout human history. And so today, because government schooling is so pervasive and has been so dominant in our lifetime and a few lifetimes before us, to present an idea like parents teaching their own children feels very radical, and yet it's not. It's actually the tried and true method that has been done for all of human history, and it's actually the government controlled model that is very new. So I think that's important for us to get our minds around, because today, if you tell someone I'm thinking of taking my children out of an institutional school and teaching them myself at home, people have this real strong reaction against that, as though you are doing something new and untried. So I just think that's important. As I've gone back and looked at human history, there have been a few points here and there where certain countries, nations, civilizations have sought to create an institutional form of schooling for children, but it's usually been very short-lived. It has not been dominant. The first place that I really find a presentation of the government being in control of education is in Plato's Republic. And in book 5, he presents some ideas that, again, I think are pretty radical. He says that children should be taken away from their parents at birth, and they should be put into government institutional buildings like big warehouses for children, and they should be raised by government institutions. And then he says that women should be drafted from society, those who have given birth recently, to randomly nurse these infant babies. And he says that children should be kept from their parents so completely that it would be possible or even likely that certain mothers would end up, as they're drafted to serve the community or serve society or serve the collective or the whole, as they're nursing these babies in these government institutions, that they could incidentally be nursing their own biological children, but they should never even be aware of that because the separation would be so radical between mother and child. And he says famously, and I quote, no parent should know his child, and no child should know his parent. He believed that children should be raised by the state. So he says basically, I'm paraphrasing wildly here, but he says basically, I know this is a hard sell. It's going to be hard to get people to go along with this, but if we could, if I could convince people of this, I believe it would be to the greatest benefit of the state to do this. So this idea, along with some of his others, that like women should be held as common property and bought and sold like cattle. Some of these ideas thankfully didn't take root in society and were rejected. And I'll just throw this out there because there's been a resurgence and interest in classical education, and so many parents want their kids to read the great classics of the Greek period, and will often hand their children books like Plato's Republic and say, here, read this. This is good stuff. And I think most parents have no idea some of the ideas that are actually promoted in this ancient pagan literature. So you should be aware of that before you hand this off to your high school student and say, hey, read this. This is great stuff. But we had a series, we had a period in the, 1700s that we call the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a philosophical pushback really against the Protestant Reformation. And it was seeking to establish reason and rationality as the basis for all things. And so they drew a lot from ancient Hellenistic or Greco-Roman writings and brought a lot of those ancient Aristotelian, Platonic, Socratic ideas into Europe during the 1700s, beginning with John Locke and then others. But one of the guys that was an Enlightenment philosopher who was bringing some of these ideas back into the public consciousness in the 1700s was a guy who was a French philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was a fascinating character, and when you and really he's the most influential writer in the history of the world as it relates to education. Nobody has influenced education more than Rousseau. He wrote a series of books called Emile, and in this series of books, he basically posits the same idea that Plato had. In fact, he says very directly, if you want to know what public education should look like, which is what he was calling for, he said, read Plato's Republic. So Rousseau believed that children should be taken from their parents at birth, should be given to government institutions, that they should never see their children again, and that this would be for the best interest of the state. Just a few things to know about Rousseau personally. He didn't merely teach this idea, he actually walked it out. And a lot of this had to do with his rejection of Christian ideas, which was very much what the Enlightenment was. It was the idea that these Christian ideas are antiquated and that we need to get rid of them and replace them with rationalistic ideas. But one of the doctrines that came out in the Reformation was the doctrine of human depravity, that people are not good. And Rousseau didn't like that idea. He rejected that really soundly. He believed that all people were born morally good, and given the right context or the right opportunity, that moral goodness would flourish within them. And so Rousseau taught this concept called the doctrine of the noble savage. And his idea was basically that if you could take a child at infancy and place this baby alone on a deserted island, and this infant could grow up completely isolated from society with no interaction with other humans, that they would grow up and become the pinnacle of human perfection. Because Rousseau believed that what contaminated people and made them bad was not an inner moral badness, but it was society. And that when good people all got together, they somehow corrupted each other and made each other bad. That was his thesis. And so Rousseau personally had, I believe, some very disturbing and troubling personal issues that played into perhaps shaping his perspective or worldview somewhat. He was abandoned by his mother when he was a young child. His father decided that he couldn't care for Jacques, and so he dropped him off at some relatives' home and basically vanished from his life. And so I believe psychologically he would probably be labeled today with reactive attachment disorder, because he just was so afraid of like real relationships with people. As far as we know from studying his life, he was mostly a hermit. He didn't go out much. He didn't interact much with people in society. We don't believe he traveled more than about a 5-mile radius of where he was born in his whole lifetime. He just stayed home and wrote books and changed the world. The issue you will find with a lot of the people who wrote the most about government education and raising children and how to teach children, it's ironic because most of them were never parents and never raised their own children. So Rousseau actually did live with a woman for 9 years that he refused to marry. During that 9-year period, she became pregnant 5 times and gave birth to 5 different children. And with each successive child, he would take the baby as an infant in a basket, carry it down the street to a foundling asylum, which is today a government orphanage, and he would drop the baby off at the doorstep and leave, and never saw any of his 5 children again after they were born. And years later, he was asked by a reporter why he did this, and he just responded very callously that he believed that it was in the best interest of society. And he was asked also, were these boys or girls? And he just sort of shrugged and said, it never occurred to me to check the sex of the child. And so on one level, we could look at Rousseau and say he probably dealt with some pretty deep psychosis personally based on his being rejected at an early age by his own parents. But he also very much ideologically agreed with Plato's concept that the people who knew best who knew what was best for society were the people who had become elected political officers. In Rousseau's worldview, those were the people who were the cream of the crop. They had elevated, like the cream, to the surface and separated themselves from the rest of the citizens and were elected by their peers because there was something better innately about them. Maybe they were better orators or better thinkers, or they had more wealth or better breeding or something. But somehow, because they had been elected as government officials, they're the ones that we should trust to kind of lead us into the future. And so, when the pragmatic or practical problem with the noble savage is that you only have so many deserted islands where you can abandon babies and leave them to raise themselves. So you have to go with the next best thing, which is Plato's idea of you abandon your baby when it's born and you let the state raise the child because the state knows what is best. So I know I'm being long-winded here, but basically this began to bring about a distrust of parents, that parents are not capable of raising their own children, that the state is smarter. The government officials are smarter than parents, and they need to be the ones to raise their children. And interestingly, in cities that were largely Protestant, and in countries like Germany and Switzerland and England and Holland, where there were a lot of people who were influenced by reformational thinking, they were extremely reactive against this concept and actually burned Rousseau's books in the public square in protest, and said that any person who would claim that a child should be taken away from his parents and put into an institution and educated by the government, that person was clinically insane and no one should ever listen to them. And that's how radical and visceral the reaction to government education was when Rousseau's books were released in the late 1700s or kind of mid 1700s. There was not a popular acceptance or embrace in most places when his books came out.
Wow, that is rich. That was awesome history. So
can I add a few more things here?
Absolutely.
Okay, so another guy that I have to talk about real quickly, if you go over to Prussia, which is modern day Germany, there's a guy named Friedrich Froebel. And Froebel was not married. He never raised children. Was, I would say today, we call him kind of a Unitarian. So he believed in some sort of a, higher moral consciousness, but he didn't believe in like a personal God in the way that Christians do. But anyway, he was a tutor of young boys from about the age of 5 to the age of 9. And one of the things that he noted about these boys that he was teaching was that they were very bad behaviorally. And he was a big fan of Rousseau. And he also believed that children were born morally good. But he had a different thesis on what corrupted children than Rousseau. Rousseau believed that society corrupted children. And yet he knew that these boys who were very disobedient and very misbehaved and that were almost impossible to teach because they were just so out of control, that they had been corrupted in some way from the moral goodness in which they were originally born. But how do you account for that? Because in Rousseau's perspective, which was pretty true, they weren't old enough, they'd never really interfaced with society. So society didn't corrupt them. So in this sort of Sherlock Holmes whodunit process of elimination process, he asked, who had the motive and who had the opportunity, right, to morally corrupt these children. And the only people who had the opportunity were the parents. And so Rousseau concluded that parents somehow, for some reason that he couldn't understand, inexplicably morally corrupted their children and made them bad. And so he believed that it was essential for teachers or tutors like himself, if they were going to be able to teach these children, to get the children as early as possible before they became morally corrupted by their parents. And this is so important. It is so important that people understand that this shifted everything in education. Everything in education pivoted on Froebel. And so he created the concept of the kindergarten, which in Germany, kinder meaning child and Garten meaning garden, the child's garden. This idea that we need to create a perimeter, a fence around these children to protect them from the harmful influences that are destroying their moral goodness. And he believed that those influences were parents. And so he believed it was essential to get children away from their parents as early as possible so that the parents would not corrupt these children. And that's where the modern day kindergarten came from. And all early elementary, interventionist early elementary education, the daycare, the preschool, the kindergarten, all of that traces back to Friedrich Froebel. So he wrote a book called The Education of Man in the late 1700s, hugely, obviously hugely influential around the world, and really kind of mainstreamed a lot of Rousseau's ideas and sort of brought that into what became the Prussian education system. And the Prussians really franchised the government school system, if you will. And so coming out of that, Karl Marx was impressed with the Prussian education system, and in the Communist Manifesto put a free public education as being the 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto, and said in the Communist Manifesto why he thought a system of public schooling was so important. He said, we want to rescue education from the ruling middle class. Well, who was the ruling middle class at that time? It was parents teaching their own kids. So he's saying we have to rescue children from their own parents, essentially. And then he says in the Communist Manifesto, he says, but you will accuse us of seeking to destroy the most hallowed of relations between parent and child. So he called this relationship between parents and children hallowed or holy. So he says, you accuse us of seeking to destroy the most hallowed of relations between parent and child. To this crime, we plead guilty. So he said that the reason that they wanted to start the public school system was to destroy the family, to destroy the relationship, this holy relationship between parents and children, to break and divide this innate bond that there was between parents and children, and that was essential to accomplish the purposes of the state, that you had to get children away from their parents as early as possible before they're contaminated and corrupted by their parents with these wrong ideas, and the state becomes the savior then. And so much of child protective services, and I understand there are children who are legitimately abused. So don't put words in my mouth and make me say something I'm not saying. Children need to be protected from genuine abuse. I'm not denying that. But what I'm saying is much of the institutions that the government has created are predicated on this viewpoint that in general, parents are abusive powers corrupting their own children, and the government has to rescue all these children from all of these terrible, horrible parents. And so there's a presumed guilt on the part of parents that the presumption is basically parents across the board are guilty until proven innocent. And so because of that, these children have to be taken away from their parents as early as possible and raised in institutions. And so that has permeated throughout the Canadian education system, the American education system, all throughout Europe. That's where a lot of this originated, was through the idea or the concept that parents are harmful to children. And then, of course, the communists took that and really extrapolated that. And so in nations that have been influenced by socialism and big government, that idea is very pervasive, that we have to rescue the children. We have to do this for the children's sake. And we see it in international documents like the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Just go read that document. I mean, it is an extension of all of this thinking, this presumptive guilt that parents are a threat to their own children, and collectively we have to, as a society, protect children from their parents.
Wow. And look where we are today with all these issues going on with our kids in the school systems. Let's move into education versus schooling. And I love how you really embraced the biblical worldview. That was something that was very important in my years of homeschooling my children. And breaking that down, how the biblical worldview breaks down into subjects. And like, I watched one of your interviews, you even talked about math and how even that is how that you can have a biblical worldview in something as simple as math. So let's talk first about education versus schooling and then move into that.
I think there are different goals related to schooling and education. They're not synonymous. In fact, I believe that schooling is one of the greatest hindrances to true education. You first of all have to define, what is an education, and then you have to sort of define what is the goal of an education. I think the government would say that education is about creating the right kind of citizen. I would say true education is about equipping a child with the knowledge and information that they need to prepare them for life, and wisdom is them being able to take that information and use it or appropriate it in a proper way. And in order to have wisdom, of course, you have to have moral virtue. And I'm a Christian theist. I believe in God. And so I believe that you obviously can't have moral virtue if you start with an atheistic framework, that atheism does not provide for us an intellectual starting point that is capable of promoting a philosophical framework for virtue. I'm not saying atheists can't be virtuous and that they can't do good things. They can. They do often. What I'm saying is that if you go back to origins, ultimately, you have these two opposing belief systems. The one that everything has been caused by a cosmic Big Bang 14 billion years ago, where dust and gases blew up for no reason. And everything that exists in the universe, the physical material world and the invisible metaphysical world, was caused by this explosion 14 billion years ago. Well, that's that's something that, happened theoretically, but you can't get an ought out of an is. That's one of the philosophical laws of logic. And yet they try to get a whole system of law and ethics and morality and all of virtue and all of that out of dust and gases that blew up for no reason. And ultimately what you have with that as your starting point is you simply have pragmatism and utility. What is most practical or beneficial as defined by the people who are seeking to implement their own desires. But there's no objective basis for right or wrong within that. There's only, does this help us advance our causes as we see them and as we define them? And so, when you look at a true education, I think true education is seeking to provide a child with a moral framework to know how to utilize the information that they're given and to be able to use it in the best way. Christian theology teaches that we are to know God and love him and serve him, and then to love and serve our neighbor. That's Christian theology. And so the purpose of an education from within that framework is that we are preparing our children to know the God who created everything, but we're also equipping them to be prepared to love and serve their neighbors through the skills and information that they acquire. And so when we teach them science and medicine and language and law and philosophy and art and music and all of these things, it's not merely for them, for their own personal self-interest, but we are trying to equip and prepare them to be good neighbors, and to be good citizens, but to have a higher moral framework for doing so. The statist viewpoint is that those who are in control get to define what is right and wrong for society. So might equals right within statism. And so within government education, I think you really have a very different framework, because they're the ones who are deciding, first of all, what's good, and then, how people need to align with that. And we've seen that go horribly bad in nations like, Germany in the 1930s and in the USSR, and, today in North Korea and China and places where they really have cut themselves off because of their atheistic framework. They've cut themselves off from an objective source of morality. And yet they have a very strong statist viewpoint of, this is what's best for our utilitarian purposes. This is what's best for the whole as we see it and as we define it. Those who are in power basically get to be in charge. And they want your kids to just mindlessly go in lockstep with all of that and to not question it. and to simply be part of the herd, to be part of the masses. And true education is opposite of that. True education is not teaching blind conformity to the government's whims, but it's teaching critical thinking and evaluation and logic and asking questions and saying, is this really right? And is this virtuous? And should we be herding people into cattle cars and taking them off to concentration camps and so on and so forth? And on what basis? And so I believe ideologically, and obviously I have a bias. I mean, you guys have already picked up on that. I have a bias. I believe philosophically, there's a vast difference in terms of our starting points and our outcomes when you look at the goals and agenda of blind statism versus a Christian ethic that ultimately has loving and serving our neighbor at its root, as opposed to loving and serving those who are in power. And so, yeah, education and schooling, I think, are quite different from each other. Schooling seems to me increasingly less interested in true education these days, and is often the enemy of true education. And if you want your child to be truly educated, if you want them to be able to think for themselves, to be able to evaluate and to assess issues in an independent thinking way, then you're going to want to get them out of the institutions that are seeking to bind them to conformity to the status system. So yeah, education and schooling are not only not the same, I think today, increasingly, they're enemies of each other.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more on that one. In your opinion, the heart of homeschooling, what really matters?
Sure.
So here we are, we've got families who've, over this last year, they've already pulled their kids because of the aggressive LGBTQ agenda in our public school system. Some of that's creeping into our private schools as well. And some are now making decisions going into the fall about pulling their kids. And I think a lot of concern is, what do I do? What curriculum do I use? Will they meet their learning outcomes? But after all the 17 years that I homeschooled all my kids K to 12, yes, that's important, but there was the heart of homeschooling, and it is a lifestyle, and there's so much more to it. And I would love to hear more about what you think on that.
Sure. Well, maybe I can tie that question back into the question that I didn't really answer previously, which is about the difference in the curriculum. And I guess what I would say is, if you are approaching educating your children from within an atheistic framework, for example, then ultimately your viewpoint on why you teach them subjects is going to be utilitarian for the most part. That the view is you need to study these subjects and learn these subjects so that you get good grades, so that you can get a diploma, so that you can hopefully go to college, so you can get a college degree, so that you can get a job, so that you can earn a paycheck, so that you have money to be able to pay your bills and to buy things that you need, so that you can have a comfortable, affluent life and hopefully be able to have retirement and support yourself through your short years until you die and become compost and get reabsorbed into the ecosystem and are forgotten. And so basically within that framework, it's humanistic. It's the idea that we're here basically to serve ourselves and hopefully not hurt people in the meantime. As I said, I think there are some other arbitrary ethics that most atheists hold to, not because their system demands it, but simply because they, in my view, they borrow from the Christian ethic, and then kind of have a little Christian ethic plug into their atheistic worldview. I mean, ultimately, you can't get right and wrong out of dust and gases that blew up for no reason, but still they believe somehow that, we're here and somehow we ended up with consciousness from material, from simple celled organisms to human consciousness. So I guess, we ought to try to do the right things, whatever that is, as best as we define it. But within the Christian framework, those subjects really, again, are to equip you to be able to live for something higher than yourself. And so as Christians, we seek to please God. We seek to know him through the things that he's made. But we also, again, we want to be equipped to love our neighbor. So when you think about mathematics, there's an order and there's a precision to mathematics and geometry, and then in sciences and physics and so on, where we have a constancy, we have a predictability, and 2 plus 2 is always 4. It's never random, it's never chaotic. It's not 5 on Tuesday and 13 on Friday. It's predictable and orderly. Well, how do we describe that, or how do we define that, or why do we have an explanation for that? And what I would say is that it's because everything that exists in the universe came from the mind of an orderly, logical God. And one of the doctrines that we teach about God is taught about God in the Bible is a doctrine called immutability. It means that God is constant and that he doesn't change. Well, that's why we have an explanation for the laws of the universe and the constancy that we see within that mathematics works and physics work with precision and predictability, and we can build our life around that. We can fly airplanes and we can launch rockets to the moon and bring them back safely because we know these certain laws that are constant within the universe. But explosions never create precision and order and constancy. And I know this because as a homeschool student, I used to buy these science kits that would allow you to create explosions in your backyard. And so I used to blow up a lot of really cool things in my backyard. And of all the things that I blew up in my backyard, nothing ever became more orderly from an explosion. Things only became less ordered, not more. So you'd start with something that had been created by intelligence, and then you blow it up into bits where it's no longer useful, but never was there an explosion that put something back together. And yet evolution is basically saying that there was an explosion in a junkyard and it somehow formed an airplane. Well, that's not how that works. We never see that in science. That's not something that is observational science. It's the opposite of everything that we know from the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Anyway, so basically within this Christian framework, we can not only explain to our children that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but we can explain to them why. We not only explain to them that we communicate as humans, but we can explain to them why. Well, because we were created in the image of God, God communicates. I mean, in the Bible, it just says, in the beginning, God said, let there be light. Like, I mean, you get right into the Bible and God is communicating and speaking. We have an explanation for why there is not only unity and order and precision, but why there's diversity. Why is it that when we study animals that we find that there are certain animals that replicate within their own kind and yet have tremendous diversity? Like, dogs don't mate with elephants and they don't mate with birds, but within the dog kind, there's just, tons of variation of dogs or flowers or butterflies. We have this phenomenal diversity within a very defined unity, right? Well, how do we explain that? Well, within Christianity, we have the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is one, and yet he is 3 persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, eternally coexistent God, one God living together in harmony for all of eternity. And everything that God creates is consistent with that. And so music reflects that we have unity. When you play a note, that's unity. When you play these 3 notes together, you create a chord and you make harmony. And you have rhythm, which is time. Well, what is that? That is God's unity and harmony in eternity. It reflects his nature and character. So my book, Education, Does God Have an Opinion, actually goes into all of that. And it talks about how every academic subject, whether it's science or math or language arts or history or music or art, how all of those subjects point to the nature of God and what God is like and how God has revealed his character and his definition through those subjects. So all education points back to the God who created it. So this book really talks about what a biblical philosophy of education looks like. I think it's the most comprehensive book on the market related to a biblical philosophy of education. And for those who are atheists and who are humanists and libertarians who don't believe in God, I think they'll find the book fascinating too, to be honest. I think as they read it, I think they will find much that they agree with. There may be points that they don't. Obviously, we don't have the same starting point, but I think that they will find it to be a very thought-compelling book that will be fascinating for them to read as well. So what is the purpose of an education? We already kind of touched on that, but I think a huge part of what makes homeschooling different from institutional schooling, where you send your children away from you all day, is that you get to share your life with them. Again, Christianity teaches that God is relational within himself, that he has eternal fellowship within his own Godhood, within the Godhead, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, eternal fellowship. God is a relational God, and we are relational people. And in a homeschooling context, we get to have relationship with our children and share ourselves. And that's something that you can't do when you send them away from you to an institution. Even if the institution was a good institution that taught good things, you still are giving up the very best of your life for, for thousands of hours. If you just look at the stats, they say that the average teenager now spends 7.5 hours after school in digital multimedia. So they spend about 7.5 hours a day in school, and then the same amount in multimedia. That's 15 hours a day. And in the US, the average mom spends an hour a day interacting with her children, and the average dad is 29 minutes. When you add that up over time, you just see that parents are just giving away the most powerful leverage that they could ever have for influence in the life of their child, which is time. Time is the most powerful force for influencing another person, and they're giving it away to other people that they don't know. And then when their children are 15, 16 years old, they're shocked that their children don't embrace their beliefs and values and don't want to have a relationship with them. And the reason for that is that other people have had more influence on them than the parents by de facto. And so this is a phenomenal opportunity for us as parents to buy back time, which equals influence, and to be able to raise our children with our own beliefs and our own values. And I'm supportive of that, whether people have a religion or no religion. If you're a Hindu, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Buddhist, if you're an atheist, you still have the opportunity to give your children the best of yourself. And I think that's something that all children crave, all children want and desire. And I wholeheartedly support that. And within the legal structure within the US, our homeschool associations all fight for that. We fight for the right of all parents to teach their children their values, even when we disagree with their values. The state doesn't want that. The state fights against parents being able to pass on their beliefs and values to their children. But for us as Christians, we believe that, as long as it's not something that is truly abusive to a child, we believe that parents are the ones who are best suited to pass on their own beliefs and values to their own children.
I totally agree. My kids are now in their late 20s, early 30s, and I think the years we homeschooled just nurtured not just the sibling. They're just so close. They're also very close to me. We have a very tight family network, and I've seen this over and over in homeschooling families that stay the course and go and do the long haul. The relationships are very, very rich.
Yes.
I'd like to tap into socialization. This is sort of just part of what you're saying already. The big question still remains, even after 45 years of homeschooling in North America. What about socialization? Will my kid be socialized? And how I see it, there's positive socialization and there's negative socialization. And if you can talk into that a bit too.
Well, I know some of our viewers and listeners are probably getting tired of me banging on my Bible drum, but again, the Bible actually talks about this. In Proverbs 13:20, it says that if we walk with wise people, we will become wise, but a companion of fools will be destroyed. That's the way the King James Version puts it. Mm-hmm. So as a parent, I think about the truth of that, and I think, okay, I don't want my child to be destroyed or suffer harm. I think some translations put it that way. But I don't want my child to suffer harm and certainly don't want them to be destroyed. So how can I avoid that? Well, according to the scripture, I'm supposed to teach my child how to find wise people. So, just even using common sense, I think we can look at society and ask ourselves, who would tend to be wiser? Someone who is a child's peer, the same age as them, or someone who is older and has life experience? Well, typically we would tend to look at older people who have some life experience. And those are the people that the Bible says our children need to actually be hanging around. This idea that our children need to be hanging around children their own age in order to be properly socialized, that's a socialist concept that actually comes out of Marxism. And if you remind me, I will try to come back to that. Because that concept of, well, you need to have your children in the school with 30 or 40 other students or they won't be properly socialized. And then if they're not properly socialized, they will grow up and be social misfits and they will not be able to fit into society and they will not know how to be good citizens. That mantra came from somewhere, and I'll explain that if you remind me. But there's another Bible verse in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15:33. And Paul says, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good character. And so there's this notion that parents have that, well, I know there's a lot of bad kids in the school system, but my kid's a good kid. And my good kid can go into that school system and transform it and can make all of those bad kids turn good. And Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:33, don't be deceived, don't be misled. That's not how that works. The bad kids have a corrupting influence on the moral framework of the good kid. And so parents are extremely naive on these points and have really bought into something that I think is harmful. So I'll jump into now the issue of the socialization issue and where it came from. In America, John Dewey was the most influential American educator. He was the founder of the progressive movement. He was a teacher of teachers at Columbia University, at the Teachers College there. He was a signer of the first Humanist Manifesto. He was an atheist. He strongly leaned towards socialistic ideas. And he was invited to go to the USSR in 1927 at the invite of Joseph Stalin's wife. Now, Stalin's wife believed that John Dewey was the greatest educator in the world. And so she invited him to come to the USSR to learn how to teach economic socialism in the American school classroom. It was a trade-off. She said, we want you to teach us everything you know about pedagogy, and we will equip you to teach economic socialism. And so he went over there, came back the next year in 1928, and he wrote an essay praising the Soviet school system, which he believed was, a phenomenal. He was very supportive of the Bolshevik Revolution, believed that it was a great thing. And one of the things that he noted was that both the Prussian schools in this time, as well in Germany, as well as the Soviet schools, had both gone to the school classroom model of like 30, 40 students the same age. And what they had found is that for the most part, they could break the allegiance of children from their parents simply by creating a herd or a peer group. That the very existence of the 30 to 40 student classroom was enough to make about 90% of the students peer dependent in 1 year's time. And at the end of that 1 year, those students cared more about what their friends thought than what their parents thought. They cared more about the values of their friends than the values of their parents. They wanted to fit into the social society of the classroom more than they wanted to fit into the social structure of the family. And so when Karl Marx said we want to destroy the most hallowed of relations between parent and child, and said we need a public school system to do that in the Communist Manifesto, that was all part of his strategy. So if you remember reading some of the old books about the prairie days, where they had these schools, one-room schoolhouses, where all the students were like K to 8, all in the same room, multiple grades all in one room. Well, John Dewey wanted to obliterate that because he believed that you couldn't quite break the allegiance of the child from the parent using that structure. So one of the things he learned from the Soviets, and he met with Vladimir Lenin's widow while he was over there, and again, just highly influenced by them, came back and said that the Soviet model needs to be the model for the American school system, and actually set up a kind of exchange system with the Soviet schools, where in the 1930s, the Soviets came and set up a booth at the NEA convention, the National Education Association, the teachers convention, inviting American teachers to go to Russia to learn how to teach economic socialism in the American school classrooms. And that happened in the 30s. And they estimate that, perhaps maybe 3,000 teachers may have traveled to the USSR to be trained in teaching socialism in the classroom. And so he changed that whole structure. And so this idea that, well, if your children aren't in this class with these 30 to 40 other students the same age, they won't be properly socialized. You have to listen to the terminology that's used here. Social education, socialization, socialism, right? These all come, social security, these ideas all come out of socialism. In fact, Dewey in 1930 told his two colleagues at Columbia University, James Mendenhall and Harold Rugg, he told them, I want you to change the textbooks while I'm changing the structure of the classroom. And so they took out 3 subjects that had been taught as independent subjects, history, civics, and geography. And they took those out of the curriculum in 1930 in the US, and they replaced them with a Marxist curriculum and a new subject that had never been taught before called social studies. That's where social studies came from, was 1930, John Dewey. And that social studies curriculum was taught in the US from about 1930 to 1950. And so there's about 20 years where about 5 million US students got indoctrinated into socialism. And then in 1950, some parents found out what their kids had been learning the last 20 years, and they had a more conservative resurgence where they threw out that curriculum. And from about 1950 to 1965, there was a more conservative resurgence here in the US. And then since 65, it's just been, greased slide to progressive hell. But since that, but in that time, that's where our seniors in the United States were educated, in these 30 to 40 student classrooms being taught the social studies curriculum. So many of the seniors in our country are actually more socialist in their thinking and their worldview than I am. Of course, I was homeschooled, so I was raised outside of the matrix, if you will. But I'm just saying, like, they have a very socialistic mindset, and it was because it was taught specifically in the curriculum, but it was also reinforced by a peer pressure within the classroom. And final thing I'll say on that, another guy that's good to look up on this is Solomon Asch. I think he spelled his last name A-S-C-H, maybe something like that. And he did these conformity experiments in the 1950s and 60s in the university campuses. And they would test students in control groups to see how likely or prone they were to be susceptible to peer pressure as university students. So they would take one student, for example, and create a control group where everyone in the classroom knew that it was a control group except for one student. And they would ask a very simple question, like, what year did Christopher Columbus discover America? And they'd say 1492. Well, everyone in the class would be instructed to give a wrong answer. So they would say like 1776. And so they go around the class just giving the wrong answer. And so finally it would come back to this one student who was the control student, or who didn't, the test subject, the guinea pig, who did not know that this was a control class or a social experiment. And they would ask them, what year did Christopher Columbus discover America? And 3/4 of the time, these university students would give the wrong answers, knowing it was the wrong answer, because of conformity with the classroom, that they wanted to fit in with the class. And when asked later, did you actually think that it was 1776? They'd say, no, I didn't. I knew it was 1492. And they would say, well, why did you say 1776 when you knew that wasn't the right answer? And they would say two things. Number one, I started questioning my own sanity. Everyone else in the class was saying this over and over. And so I thought there must be something wrong with me. There's something wrong with my cognition. I'm not thinking clearly, or, my judgment is off. I'm just going to go with the rest of the group because they must be right. Everybody's doing this, so everybody else must be right. Something's off with me today. Or sometimes they would say, well, I knew they were wrong, but I didn't want to face the ridicule of the classroom. And so 3/4 of university students would give the wrong answer on tests simply to fit into the social system of the classroom, even when they thought their grade depended on it and it could adversely affect their future careers. They would give the wrong answer. And so if that is true at the university level, how is that not going to be true in junior high, where you would rather die than face the ridicule of the classroom? And how is it not true in elementary when you are a 7-year-old who's told to go and listen to this 40-year-old teacher who knows everything? And she's telling you this is true, and everybody else in the class is telling you it's true, and they'll laugh at you if you don't go along with it. It just shows the power of that. And then finally, on the Solomon Asch experiments, they found that about 10% of people in society are psychologically hardwired that they don't give a darn what anybody else thinks about them. They just don't care. And that 10% will turn around, look at the whole rest of the classroom and say, you guys are idiots. Like, don't you know anything? 1492, guys, like, have you never studied history? And so they are totally immune to the social pressure of that kind of environment. And there's like just 10% of people in society that are like that. But literally 3/4 will go along with the crowd, even if it's something diabolical, even to the point, where they started turning the heat up on this and saying that people would actually cause harm to another person if they believed that it would keep them from facing ridicule. And a lot of that goes back to a quote from the Danish existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard, who said that man is a social animal. Only in the herd is he happy. And then he says, it is all one to him whether something is the greatest villainy or the profoundest nonsense. He cares not so long as it is the view of the herd and he gets to join the herd. And that is really what these social conformity experiments do, is in the classroom, is they teach you to not care whether what you're about to participate in is the greatest villainy towards someone else or the profoundest nonsense, just idiocy, as long as it's the view of the herd and you get to go along with the herd. And so again, for us as parents, we don't want our kids being raised in that system. So what that is, all of that is socialization. When you hear the word socialization, retrain your brain that that's what they mean by this. That's what the progressives meant when they started grilling this idea of socialization into everybody's mind. That we, even as homeschoolers, validate the argument. When someone says, well, what do you do about socialization? We start listing 100 ways in which we have our children spending lots of time with other children. Why do we do that? It's because we're actually agreeing with and buying into their assumptions and their presuppositions. We need to actually question the presuppositions and ask, is that really the dominant social influence we want our children to be facing? Is their peer group, other young and foolish people their own age? Is that really who we want to be shaping the minds of our children? No, we don't. We want them to be hanging out with wise people who actually know something. And so rather than assuming the false premise of the socialization myth that children have to be around 30 or 40 other students their own age in order to be properly socialized, understanding the origins of all of that, we should actually think, I don't want my child to grow up and be a socialist. I don't want them to be indoctrinated into that. And so I want to have them raised in an environment where they actually are with people who know how to think and who have wisdom, and be influenced by those people instead.
And as parents too, when the children are home, you can control who the healthy kids are for your child and who aren't.
Yes.
And as you maybe enroll them in, community sports teams, there's other ways to meet new people as well. And you find like-minded, even homeschool kids in these sports teams as well. And yeah, I totally understand and support what you're saying. In addition to the book you were just talking about, Education, Does God Have an Opinion? Tell us a little bit more about another book, 25 Top Questions Critics Ask. It's a Answers for Homeschooling. Yeah, that one.
Yeah,
What's in there?
so Answers for Homeschooling, subtitled The Top 25 Questions Critics Ask. This book was written because I for years, I've gotten the same questions over and over. And I wanted to just take the common objections that people raised of why homeschooling is bad, why it's bad for children, why it's bad for society, and just obliterate all of those objections with facts and research. So it's not just my opinion versus your opinion, but we actually have studies on almost all of these issues now. And so I have a chapter in here on socialization. I have a chapter on the argument that, well, you're not qualified to teach your child. You're just a mom. You're just a parent. You're not a certified teacher. You're not a professional. You can't possibly give your child the same quality of academic training that a school could. I address that issue. How can you afford it? How can you homeschool when you have to live on a single income? What about the finances? And then I talk a lot about methodology. So in homeschooling, there's lots of different approaches that can be very overwhelming to people when they start hearing about it. There's unschooling, there's classical, there's Charlotte Mason, there's principal approach, there's traditional textbook, there's unit study, there's eclectic, there's all these different educational philosophies, if you will. I go through all of them and kind of give the pros and cons of each one. I talk about what's a father's role in homeschooling, or the question, well, what about the single parent who couldn't, homeschooling is not for everybody. Like, think about the single parents. Well, one of the unique things about that particular argument is my mother, who homeschooled myself and my 5 sisters, did so entirely in an era where homeschooling was illegal. I graduated from homeschooling in 1991, and homeschooling did not become legal in the state in which I lived until 92. And so we actually did get caught a couple of times for homeschooling. We ended up in court a few times related to homeschooling. And so I tell a little bit about our story in here, but my mom was a single parent mother, homeschooling 6 children when homeschooling was illegal. And to add to that, not only was my mom a single parent, but she dropped out of public school in 9th grade. So my mom was a high school dropout who successfully homeschooled me and my sisters when homeschooling was not even legal. So people who say, well, not everybody can homeschool. If you really want to homeschool your children, you can figure it out. You can do it if you really want to, but that's actually the issue. The issue is the want to part. And if you want to, this book explains to you how to get there. So it goes over really everything you would ever want to know, any question you would possibly ask about homeschooling. You can get the answers for that within this book, Answers for Homeschooling. And both of these books are available on my website, in print, but for Canada, which is my website is familyrenewal.org. But for Canada, your best option might be to go to christianbook.com. If you're familiar with them, they have books that they can ship you, or my publisher, masterbooks.com. In fact, some of my books are available in audio. All of them are available as ebooks. So if you go to masterbooks.com, you can get the ebooks on all of my titles for like $6 US. They do have some of them as available as audio now, or you can order print copies. So that's masterbooks.com. And you can order on Amazon, but I encourage parents oftentimes when they're looking at buying my books to not buy there. A lot of people don't know this, but if my book is like, say, I don't know how to convert it to Canadian, but if my book is like US, if it's $14 in the US as an author, I make about 65 cents from the sale of that book on Amazon. Amazon keeps almost all the profits when you're a traditionally published author. And so this is what I do full time. I'm an author and conference speaker, and I have 11 kids. It's how I support my family. So if you buy from my publisher, masterbooks.com, that's super helpful for me, or even christianbook.com. They're fair. But Amazon, that's why they own the world, man. That's why, because they just keep all the money. So I encourage people to find like a local Christian retailer, and you can request my books from them if you have a bookstore near you. So again, my name is Israel Wayne, and I forgot to mention also I have a website called israelwayne.com, and I will be speaking in Ontario next year. I don't have the exact dates, but I know on the Action for Canada website, there's a link to OCHEC in Ontario. If you go to Action for Canada's website and go down there and look at the homeschool resources, OCHEC in Ontario has a website, and you can go there and get registered for my conference where I'll be speaking, I think in May or June, sometime of 2024. And would love to see you if you are living over in Ontario. And I do travel. I've spoken at least in 4 of the provinces in Canada. So I do get up there. And if you're interested in booking me to come speak at your event in person, or to do a webinar like this, you can book me through our israelwayne.com website, and we would be glad to link up and try to work with you.
I saw PDF on christianbook.com with the books as well. And then the master books included the audio versions as well, which is great if you're in the car. That's how I did all my listening back in the day. I just put everything on in the car and the kids had to listen with me.
There you go.
Yeah. So yeah, really appreciate that. We got one question here about your view on Christian schools. And,
Okay,
and then after that, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I have a whole chapter in Education, Does God Have an Opinion, called Christian Schools versus Homeschool. I did attend Christian schools 2 years during my education because we got busted for homeschooling, and homeschooling was not a legal option. And so the judge asked my mother, he said, you have 2 options, A and B. Option A, you put your children into public school, or option B, you have your children taken away from you, they'll be put into foster care, your parental rights will be terminated, you'll never see your kids again, and oh, by the way, they'll be put in public school. So which would you prefer, A or B? I mean, can you imagine? This is not the Soviet Union or North Korea. This is like the United States in the 1980s, right? The land of the free and the home of the brave. But this just shows you how much monopoly the government school system had created in our country. Anyway, she said, I'm going to choose option C, private Christian school. So I spent 2nd grade and 6th grade in private Christian schools. And at the end of that year, she pulled us out, we moved, and she kind of went underground homeschooling again. And so I do talk about Christian schools. It's too complicated for me to get into here because it would take a while. But basically, in terms of biblical worldview, the Christian schools are almost inseparable from public schools in terms of biblical worldview, as determined by the Pearce test, which is a biblical worldview assessment test. So the average tuition in the US has gone up from about $9,600 per year per student to over $12,000 now post-COVID. So before COVID, it was $9,600. Post-COVID, now it's like $12,000 per year per student. And basically, your kids are less likely to be Christian, less likely to embrace the Christian faith, less likely to have Christian beliefs or Christian values, less likely to have Christian behavior, less likely to have close relationship with you as parents when they're older, less likely to attend church, all of that if they attend Christian schools than if they are homeschooled, and significantly so. So the outcomes are pretty abysmal for most Christian schools in the US, and I would believe also probably in Canada. There's also a lot of woke curriculum that's starting to come in, critical race theory. A good friend of mine was just fired from a Christian school. He was a science teacher, and they started teaching critical race theory. He objected. He was teaching in Atlanta, Georgia. They fired him right on the spot for questioning their teaching of critical race theory in the Christian schools. So I'm not 100% against all Christian schools categorically, but the way that it tends to be implemented, you're paying a ton of money and not likely going to get the results that you want. It's more complicated than that, but that's kind of the basics.
Well, I can appreciate that whole conversation for sure. So Tanya, did you have anything you want to add before Israel wraps this up?
Yeah, Israel, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. We're going to make sure that this video goes out far and wide because I think the information is really important. I love the historical value that you added because, we've been conditioned to think that we can just trust the education system. I didn't really think I was putting my kids in private school. Things in my life changed. I homeschooled for a bit and then they ended up in public education, but I was very, very closely involved with everything that was going on, volunteering and reading programs, field trips, and all the rest of it. And it was just really essential. But when I look at the history, when you talk about Dewey, when we talk about Marx, when we talk about the socialism, it just puts a whole new perspective on where it is that we're dropping kids off every day. And we had Alex Newman on a few weeks ago on our Empower Hour, and he's got a great analogy. He says the building is on fire,
Yeah.
and we're going every day and dropping our kids off and saying, "Have a nice day, honey." And especially right now with this radical trans LGBTQ agenda, as you mentioned, the critical race theory, the climate change fear mongering, it's just devastating. And I just really want to encourage our viewers to look up Israel Wayne, go to his website. We'll make sure that everything is in the description when we post the video, as well with Action for Canada. Doris is our homeschooling and parent lead. And if we're going to be saying, get your kids out of school, right, and ringing the bells, we've been doing this for years. What we've done is set up that homeschooling page. And if you go to current issues in our menu, you will find Homeschooling Revolution. You will find the directory in there and a lot of other really critical information to get you started. Just want to mention as well, Doris will probably mention it as well, but that we're taking a break from the parent webinar till mid-August. We want families to enjoy themselves over summer, and then we're going to come out with a bang because we're going to be really encouraging parents to pull their children out of school. I always say the bums in seats for the public education can be $14,000, whatever it is in Canada, if it's a handicapped child, which we know that autism is no longer 1 in 10,000, it's down to 1 in 36. That's, for reasons that we've had shows on before, they're tying it directly back to the childhood vaccinations. And so if we remove our kids from the public school system, principals don't get paid. That means they can't manage the electric bill, they can't keep teachers employed, and we have a lot of power in just simply removing our children from school. And I know it's not simply because they've forced parents that they both need to be working to make ends meet, but you can do it. Join an Action for Canada chapter as well, because we're trying to connect parents so that they can create these pods, learning places. We're reaching out to churches to open their doors so that we can help facilitate parents to homeschool as well and create partnerships. Maybe parents might need to take a 1 day off a week and, have a group of kids that they teach for 1 day and share that responsibility with other parents. But there are solutions and there is a way around this. We don't have to comply, and we certainly don't have to sacrifice our children to the system by feeling pressured to do so. And so again, Israel, thank you so much. And Doris, back to you.
Yeah, I do a lot of parenting seminars and speak in churches on theological issues and Christian apologetics. And so, yeah, a lot of different topics. In fact, a lot of audio downloads are available from my familyrenewal.org site. So you can go and kind of browse through there and see if there are topics that would be relevant. But I've been doing conference speaking for almost 30 years. So, I have a long history of having covered a lot of topics, a lot of ground in that time.
Thank you. So as we wrap up here, what would be your encouraging words to those who are in that space of they've just either pulled their kids or they're now going to? What could we say to them to encourage them along the way?
Yeah, well, I sometimes tell people, and I think, again, the Answers for Homeschooling book will really give you a template of what home education is supposed to look like. Because most people have a public school mentality, but even if you hadn't gotten my book yet, you're still waiting on the book to get there to give you a template of what homeschooling is supposed to look like. Basically, just think of everything the public school system does, and then don't do that. They just do the opposite of what they do. And that'll probably get you pretty close to where you need to go. What I often say to people is that homeschooling is not some weird thing that you add to your life. Like, oh, now we're starting to homeschool. Everybody homeschools. You know, you start homeschooling your child from birth. Everyone homeschools their child till they get to compulsory attendance age, and then they stop homeschooling and they stick them in an institution. So my encouragement is just to keep homeschooling. And in fact, a lot of the really hard things you teach your kids before you send them off to school. You have just been indoctrinated by the school system that you're too stupid, incompetent, and unable to teach your own child. And you know what I sometimes say to parents who feel that way is, and what's the solution to that? And they say, well, I'm going to put my child into school. I say, what school? Well, the same school I went to. It's like, okay, so the net result of your public school education is that your public school made you too stupid, too incompetent, and too inept to teach your own child. And so now you want to take your child and put your child into that school, so they'll grow up and be too stupid, incompetent, and inept to teach their children. So your grandkids will also go to that school, and how many generations are you going to perpetuate that cycle? You know, if you're on a train that's going south and your intention is to go north, the way to go north is not to run as fast as you know how in a northerly direction on a southbound train. That's not how you get north. The way to go north is you have to get off the train that is going south and get on a train that's going north. And so parenting is the goal here. And you have a lot of tools in the parenting toolbox. And now you're going to add some academics. So homeschooling is not some weird other thing that you do. Homeschooling is parenting with academics. And so now you already taught your child how to read, how to write, how to walk, how to tie their shoes, you know, all the basics, how to eat with a fork without impaling themselves. And you taught them how to be potty trained, right? I think people should get a PhD if they can teach a toddler how to be potty trained. I mean, that's just my opinion. But you taught your children all these things. Just keep teaching them, but start to add in academics. And you can do this. You're not too stupid. You're not too incompetent and inept. That's a lie that the school system has told you because they want your kid, because your kid represents a boatload of money to them. As Doris said, especially if they can label your child, then they usually get twice as much money for your child. And so this is why it's so important for you to be the parent. And so just look at homeschooling as parenting with academics. And the main goal is parenting, is preparing your child for life, but using academics as part of the toolbox, you know, tools in the toolbox that you use to prepare them for life.
Love it. Really, really appreciate you spending time with us, and yeah, just sharing so many deep thoughts. And I feel very encouraged. I think a lot of our listeners are encouraged based on the comments that are coming through the chat here. Thank you again, Israel Wayne, for being here with us. Thank you, everybody that's attended and signed in, for being here. We're going to sign off now. And you can reach me at homeschooling@actionforcanada.ca. If you have any questions at all, you can go through our website, find your province, get connected to your provincial homeschool group. They will also have additional resources and curriculum ideas to help you get started on your journey into homeschooling. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy your day. And like Tanya said, we will be off for the month of July, but we will resume back in mid-August. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you. God bless.